Welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! History with Giorlando. In today's video, we are going back to fall 2006, a format that we've actually looked at when we talked about Cyberstein OTK, and profiling a deck that I think gives a lot of insight into deck building and understanding trends in the meta. It's a deck that only really saw success at one event, but it was for very, very particular reasons. And it saw so much success at that one event that I think it's really warranting its own video. We're going to look at Chimeratech OTK. So a little bit of history here. Power of the Duelist comes out, and we see the release of Future Fusion, Overload Fusion, and Chimeratech. Very obvious, the combination of those three cards can put a gigantic Chimeratech on the field with 8,000 plus attack, if not more, depending on how many machines are in your deck. And the combination of those two cards with Giant Trunade, which during the summer, during Chaos Return, was actually 3, made it so that it was a pretty easy OTK to pull off. You got triple Trunade, Heavy Storm, you got 3 Overload, 3 Future Fusion. However, Future Fusion was limited to 1 basically upon release. You maybe had a local scene before the ban list took effect, before Power of the Duelist was really in circulation. You may have been able to sneak a local in with 3 Future Fusions. But when fall 2006 rolls around, Future Fusion is immediately put to 1, and in the eyes of many, made the deck far less playable. And when you actually go to an event and want to OTK, and you have one option on one hand of saying, do I play the deck with 3 Cyberstein and 3 Megamorph plus Limiter? Or do I play the deck with 1 Future Fusion and 3 Overloads? The decision was really easy. So during the early stages of the fall 2006 format, I'm talking about events like SJC Boston, my very first organized major event that literally changed my life because it hooked me onto competitive play, to some of the later events, the SJC in Anaheim, and going forward. You're just going to play Cyberstein. It's obvious. It's a deck. Granted, there's that life point concern, but you have multiple copies of Cyberstein 3, and you have 3 copies of Megamorph plus the double Trunade. If you're going to compare OTKs, it was very obvious that Cyberstein was the better choice. However, Cyberstein was emergency banned December of 2006, the 3rd week of December in 2006, which means going forward, if players wanted to play OTK-based strategies, now what was considered a secondary, lower tier OTK like Chimeratech suddenly crept back into the picture. What's really important to note is that if you look and analyze what that is going to do to a format, it suddenly creates a big vulnerability in people's side deck. Because if Cyberstein gets banned, now all of a sudden cards like Wabaku, Threatening Roar, Karibo of all cards, these cards don't really make any sense. Why are you signing Karibo if Cyberstein OTK is banned? You don't have to worry about a giant Chimera, a giant Cyber End or Cyber Twin hitting the field. Which means all of a sudden, if you're going to show up to an event and summon a giant Chimeratech in games 2 and 3, you don't have to worry about these side decking choices that would have stymied that strategy a month prior. So heading into January of 2007, going over the calendar year, the very first SJC that took place was in Orlando. And 4 of the top 8 spots, 4, which is a pretty significant number. We're not talking about out of a top 32, we're talking about a top 8. 50% were OTK-based strategies centered around Chimeratech, 3 of them coming from the same team, Team Rampage. So I'm talking about an entirely warped top 8 when all of a sudden the entire format thought to themselves, well, hey, Cyberstein's banned. I can all of a sudden cut Wabaku for my side deck. And now all of a sudden an OTK deck takes SJC Orlando by storm. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about the deck building decisions, specifically in the version that Team Rampage brought 3 slots into. The deck that actually ended up winning SJC Orlando was an ancient gear-based Chimeratech deck. Maybe someday we'll eventually profile it. But today we're going to look at the deck that got 3 of the top 8 spots. The Team Rampage build was exactly the same, at least in the main deck. So I think it's the deck that's really warranting a deck profile. Team Rampage actually geographically is relatively close to where I live. I grew up in Massachusetts. They were a team centered primarily in Connecticut, though some players also in other areas of Massachusetts. But players that I would actually engage with on the regional level, see around the area. So they're players that, at least on a personal level, I know more than I know Paul Lynn, who won SJC Orlando, who I've never actually spoken to. But I've spoken to players like Labani and Jamal Plummer and Chris Flores, the players that actually were able to top 8 with this specific deck. It's a really cool deck. And what the important thing is on the paper, on the surface, the idea of playing 1 Future Fusion in an OTK-based strategy seems inconsistent. But if you actually sit down and play with this deck, you'll realize that yes, Future Fusion is often enough to win the game because it slims your deck out of 14 machines. This deck has 14 machines in it. And then you play Overload, banish all 14, and then your Chimeratech is 10,000 attack or something ridiculous. In theory, on paper, you need to have Future Fusion to pull that off. But if you actually play this deck and play during this format, where there are multiple turns back and forth when you play defensive cards like Dekoichi and UFO Turtle and Cyber Phoenix that are both defensive, but also replenishing your hand with draws through Dekoichi and Cyber Phoenix, you realize that the game can grind out for a little while. And then all of a sudden, one Overload Fusion, even if you only have 5 or 6 machines in the graveyard, might be enough to win, especially when you combine it with Dimension Fusion. Having alternative win conditions, and I'm going to really hammer this on the actual profile itself, ended up being one of the reasons that this deck was actually pretty good. And not only pretty good, so strong that it did so well at a singular event. This event took place 1 month and about 1 week since the emergency banning of Cyberstein. And going back to the beginning of the introduction, when I said that this particular deck at this particular time in Yu-Gi-Oh's history is important to note, from a historical perspective, is that emergency bannings don't happen all that often. They have certainly happened here or there. I know there have been emergency bannings during sort of the time where I took a break with Pendulum Strategies. Magical Stone Excavation kind of got an emergency limitation during Troop Dupe format. But this Cyberstein one, to me, is one of the most important limitations because it totally warped not only eliminating that deck from the format, but how that affects side decking. And when there are these slight but massive changes to, for example, the Forbidden Limited list through something like an emergency banning, it can create this huge gap of weakness in people's side decking strategies, at least going back to older Yu-Gi-Oh!, where all of a sudden a deck that may have seen tier 2 can actually take an event by storm because the side deck hate has been completely eliminated for totally unrelated reason, the emergency banning of Cyberstein, which to me is really fascinating, right? You draw it up and say, what is a banning of Cyberstein going to do? The obvious answer is people will cut Waboku. Well, what does that then do? What's the cause and effect there? Other OTK strategies. There was even rumors that decks like Benkai could have been playable at SJC Orlando. Decks like Chimeratech all of a sudden have a much easier space to work. This event is also really fascinating because it is the very first event that gadgets were legal. Red, green, and yellow gadget were finally legal at SJC Orlando. So all of the hype, and I mean all of the hype going into the event, was for gadget-based strategies, which also created that vulnerability where now an OTK deck that's going to go over the top of these gadget-based control strategies can really see significant success, which is exactly what the Team Rampage version of Chimeratech OTK was able to do. But without further ado, let's take our very first deep dive look at really the only time in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where a devoted Chimeratech OTK deck saw significant success. All right, we'll start the deck profile off with the monster. So we have to play Cyber Dragon. Obviously, in order to summon Chimeratech, you obviously need to either banish Cyber Dragon from the graveyard with Overload Fusion or send it there in the first place with Future Fusion. It is also a machine monster, and in a deck with Cyber Phoenix and limited removal, you can actually win games without having to rely on Overload Fusion. So obviously we're going to max out on Cyber Dragon. We always want it in the deck so that our Future Fusions are always live, and it's honestly just a good card at this point in time, right? A lot of people playing good stuff decks. It can attack over a Donzalug, you can attack over a Dekoichi that's set, even a Dekoichi that's face up, quite frankly. So obviously 3 copies of Cyber Dragon, that's self-explanatory. Cyber Phoenix, the targeting effect could be relevant. There are decks that are going to play Soul Exchange, Brain Control, sort of the traditional Monarch cards. Ring of Destruction is actually legal in this format, so its targeting effect actually matters. Beyond that, it just draws a card. That's quite frankly the reason we're playing it. We want to draw as many cards as possible to slim our deck. It also just fuels the graveyard for Overload Fusion. So obviously we're going to play 3 copies of Cyber Phoenix. That's also why we're going to play 3 copies of Dekoichi. It's just a great defensive card. We can set it, draw a card, replenish our hand, dig deeper to Future Fusion, dig deeper to Overload Fusion, or the OTK pieces that we need. Same goes for, though not quite as good as Cyber Phoenix, though it is quite similar. 3 copies of UFO Turtle. It is a machine, so you get to send it off of Future Fusion, banish it with Overload Fusion. You can do a play where you slim your deck by crashing UFO Turtles, and it will do a couple different things. One, it ends on a Cyber Phoenix, right? Cyber Phoenix is a fire. That's where that bridge is. 2, it fuels your graveyard for Overload Fusion. So even if you don't open Overload Fusion, you can just crash 3 UFO Turtles and then get a Cyber Phoenix, and that's already 4 machines between those, plus a replenished draw. 14 is actually a pretty important attack strength in this point in time in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. Dekoichi is a 1400. If your opponent doesn't flip Dekoichi and immediately attribute it for a Monarch, if they just leave Dekoichi in attack mode, you can crash into it with UFO Turtle. This is also true, though not in this specific deck, with Mystic Tomato. That interaction happens a lot. For those of you who probably go back and play things like GOAT format or some of the formats in and around that time period, that interaction of crashing, usually Mystic Tomato, but in this deck you have UFO Turtle into a Dekoichi can come up every now and then and kind of mitigate the draw because you just crash, get the Dekoichi off the field, and then replenish with either another UFO Turtle or going right into Cyber Phoenix. So we have a bunch of machines here between these 9 that basically just replenish your hand, or at least bridge to replenishing your hand with UFO Turtle into Cyber Phoenix. And they're obviously just machines which this deck wants. From that point on, we have some one-of monsters. We have Breaker, which is obviously not a machine, but we only have 2 Giant Trinids and a Heavy Storm, so clearing out back rows is valuable. So we have 1 copy of Breaker. You can just go Breaker, pop the back row, play Overload Fusion. So it's just as good as a Heavy Storm or Giant Trinade if your opponent's only setting 1 back row, which, quite frankly, against this specific deck, you should probably just set all your back rows because you don't want to play into Breaker being enough to OTK you. You should assume that if your opponent plays Heavy or Giant Trinade, you're just going to lose anyway, so you might as well not play around it and set all your defensive cards so you don't lose to Breaker. Just a little bit of a heads up when playing against these style of OTK decks from back in the day. So Breaker is valuable, though, if the opponent is only going to set 1 back row, not wanting to get blown out by Heavy Storm. We have 1 copy of Magician of Faith. We play Graceful Charity. Graceful Charity is such a power card. It is valuable to replenish it. There are some other reasonable spells as well. It's an okay card. I'd probably cut it, honestly, if I were to revamp this deck, but Team Rampage elected to run Magician of Faith. They also ran a Morphing Jar. Morphing Jar is fine, right? We're playing at a time where drawing 5 cards off a Morphing Jar can likely draw into enough to OTK if you didn't already have it with your first 6 cards, so having Morphing Jar is totally fine. The other 2 ones might seem a little bit out of place on the surface, but when you understand that this deck, when we get to the spells, runs Dimension Fusion, it gives this deck an alternate win condition. So we have a copy of Jinzo. It's a machine, which means we can send it off Future Fusion. And we also play Spell Canceller, which also happens to be a machine that can be sent off Future Fusion. Why we play these 2 cards is it gives the deck an alternate win condition where in the resolution of an Overload Fusion, when we banish all of these machines from our graveyard, if we are unable to actually OTK, if we have Defusion, Dimension Fusion, we can just special summon all the machines that we banished. And that can end up putting both Spell Canceller and Jinzo on the field. And then honestly, even Cyber Phoenix, not that your opponent is really going to target your machines when Jinzo and Spell Canceller are on the field. But you can imagine a situation where you use Dimension Fusion and maybe you bring back Jinzo plus Cyber Phoenix. That can be really difficult to out. No Brain Control, no Soul Exchange. Spell Canceller plus Cyber Phoenix. Now you're not afraid of Ring of Destruction. Or you can just honestly bring back both Spell Canceller and Jinzo, and then your opponent's basically out of the game, right? They'd have to special summon Cyber, attack over Spell Canceller, main phase 2, do something, and maybe they could do something. But we're not talking about modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Where cards are so explosive that you really have too much to worry about there. So Jinzo and Spell Canceller gives this deck sort of an alternate win condition if the Overload Fusion itself isn't enough to win. So that is our monster lineup. And maybe what I mean by alternate win conditions will make a little bit more sense when we take a look at the spells. So we're obviously going to play the most important card in the deck, in my opinion, which is Overload Fusion. The monsters in this deck are pretty reasonable monsters. You could, I don't say easily win a game, but you could absolutely win a game without seeing this. And without seeing this, right? Limited removal because you're playing all machines can steal wins. But even without seeing those 4 cards, you can still win games. Cyber Dragon, Cyber Phoenix, these are reasonable cards. Overload Fusion is just really, really important because obviously it summons Chimeratech. With so many machines in our deck, we can very often just increase its attack by so much and attack over all of our opponent's monsters. But it also banishes them, which is really important if we're going to play Defusion. We'll talk about Defusion in just a moment. So 3 copies of Overload Fusion. This deck elected to play 3 copies of Enemy Controller. So in general, Chimeratech has a small weak point that was somewhat common at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. A lot of the good stuff decks elected to play Spirit Reaper. Now, the thing with Spirit Reaper is if it's in defense mode, Chimeratech doesn't deal piercing or anything. So a defense position, Spirit Reaper can actually brick wall this deck. And in the long run, it can actually brick wall the deck so long that you don't really have an out to it, as long as you're not playing a card like this. Some decks elected to play Drillroid, which is a machine that can be sent off Future Fusion and then brought back with Overload Fusion. Rampage elected to instead play Enemy Controller. Now, why you'd play Enemy Controller is, 1, it can target Spirit Reaper and destroy it. That's really important. Obviously, that just gets rid of the Spirit Reaper, the problem's off the table, but it's also a defensive card, right? If you're just trying to prolong the game to draw your combo pieces, Enemy Controller is just the perfect card because it's an out to Spirit Reaper that also can just be used defensively, right? Shift something to defense, prolong the game. Your monsters can attack over defense position monsters. I wouldn't say with total ease, but with enough ease that it's not unreasonable that this card can work as sort of a pseudo removal spell. So it's defensive, it's a removal spell, and then it also just deals with Spirit Reaper. So it's a really pivotal card. They elected to play 3 copies of it. It's really important when you actually construct this deck and decide to play this deck that you acknowledge the reality of Spirit Reaper, but then also try to find cards that just prolong the game. And Enemy Control is really just the perfect card. Giant Trinade was limited to 2 during this format, so we're only going to play 2 copies. We probably would just play 3 if it was legal, but it just simply isn't. This card was at 3, but they elected to play 2, right? 3 is a little bit likely to clutter because alone, this card does literally nothing in your deck, right? Barring your opponent using Bottomless, you're not really going to ever resolve Dimension Fusion unless you combine it with Overload Fusion. That is obviously one of the ways that this deck can win without seeing Future Fusion. I haven't talked about Future Fusion yet, but I will in a little bit. Future Fusion is a really important card when we're talking about this deck, but in a natural game, in a game that you don't draw Future Fusion. Now, Future Fusion is going to send upwards, I think, 14 machines to the graveyard. There's a Magician of Faith and a Breaker and a Morphing Jar. So there's 17 monsters. So there's 14 machines in this deck. Future Fusion sends 14 machines to the graveyard, minus however many you've actually naturally drawn, making Overload Fusion basically game on the spot for the rest of the game. But it's a one-of, and it's non-searchable. You have to naturally draw it. Yes, you're slimming your deck with Decoichi and UFO Turtles, and you have... I'll eventually get to the trap lineup with cards like Jar of Greed, but there's still a possibility in quite a lot of games, to be honest, you just don't draw Future Fusion. But this deck is naturally just going to grind through machines, and as long as you see a Cyber Dragon along the way, Overload Fusion suddenly becomes live, but sometimes you're going to Future Fusion, or rather Overload Fusion for 4 monsters. And you're going to summon a relatively small Chimeratech, and that Chimeratech's attack strength is not likely to win the game. However, by having Defusion in your deck, now all of a sudden when you use Overload Fusion, you can Defusion and just spam 5 monsters onto the field. And we're talking about a time period in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where Lightning Vortex is not particularly common, and at that point people are going to try and grind through your board with, Smash and Ground was very common, particularly in decks like Gadgets. You have cards like Sekarat Swarmer. Those cards just don't deal with 5 monsters, especially if the monsters are a giant Chimeratech, Spell Canceller, Jinzo, Cyber Phoenix, cards that are going to replenish advantage like UFO Turtle. So that board is really difficult to deal with, and even if you don't win the game on the spot with Chimeratech, having Defusion gives you an alternative win condition where in the games where you just grind through a little bit, fill your graveyard up with 4, 5, 6 machines, now all of a sudden Overload Fusion is threatening because not only does it summon a giant monster, it also makes your Defusions, whether at that turn or any turn going forward, basically a game on the spot because it's really difficult to grind through a huge field like that with the resources that people had and the tools that people had all the way back at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. So Defusion might seem a little bit out of place because you think to yourself, what is the consistent stream of banishing? It's really Overload Fusion. Overload Fusion is an important piece because it can OTK on the spot. It obviously combines with Future Fusion for basically game on the spot, but it is the primary way of banishing cards for Defusion. Past that, we have a bunch of one-ups. So we have sort of an obvious one with Graceful Charity. Every deck played Graceful Charity. It is a staple. Heavy Storm. Obviously, we're going to be playing Giant Trinates, so obviously we're going to play Heavy Storm. Every deck more or less played Heavy Storm. Sword of Revealing Light is a card that, at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, started to fall out of favor. It was much more common earlier, but in this deck it makes sense. We have a lot of flip effects that we want to protect, and if you can get things like Morphing Jar to resolve, that's really great. We play Giant Trinates, so it actually combos relatively well. It's kind of a funny combo from way back in Yu-Gi-Oh's history of, the second you realize that Swords and Giant Trinate combo, you just think you found the greatest combo on Earth, and card advantage-wise, it's not great. But in this deck, getting 5 turns off of attacks can be just enough that you need to draw into some of your OTK combo pieces. So we have that. We have a copy of Premature Burial, which actually also combines really well with Giant Trinate. And when this deck sends everything with Future Fusion, you theoretically could use Premature Burial to bring out a Jinzo. So there's a combo there as well. We have Limiter Removal. This deck is literally all machines minus the 3 that I alluded to earlier. So this deck is absolutely going to play Limiter. It's an alternative win condition, right? If you Chimeratech only for, let's say, 4 or 5 monsters, the Chimeratech's relatively small, but all of a sudden you use Limiter and now it's giant to attack over, let's say, 2 monsters and basically win the game on the spot. So Limiter removal is really important. Card destruction, this deck, because it has the trap cards that I'm going to talk about in a little bit, cards like Jar of Greed and Reckless Greed, and it replenishing with UFO Turtle into Cyber Phoenix plus Decoichi, maybe even Morphing Jar, quite frankly. Morphing Jar plus Giant Trinade really replenishes your hand when you can bounce all the set cards that aren't so great. Card destruction just fits that type of deck really well where you really want to draw into the combo pieces. And then the most important card is Future Fusion. So I talked about this in the introduction, but Future Fusion is a card that when it was released, it was basically immediately limited to 1. For a very, very, very small window of time, basically at the sneak preview in and around that week. At locals, you could theoretically play this deck with 3 Future Fusions, right? 3 Future, 3 Overload, and the OTK of going Future Fusion for, in this case, 14 machines, and then Overload Fusion a Chimeratech that has well over 8,000 attack points. That combo was a little bit easier to see, right? When there's 3 Future and 3 Overload. At the beginning of the format, though, the fall, they limited Future Fusion to 1. It was basically an instant limitation on set release, which means that every SJC at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history and going forward, you could only play 1 Future Fusion. So when we compared OTKs at the time, most people elected just to play Cyberstein because Cyberstein, until its emergency ban, as I alluded to in the introduction, in December of that format, was just more consistent. You could play 3 Stein, 3 Megamorph. It was a very similar deck in the sense of having cards like Trunade, but you had 3 Stein, 3 Megamorph, plus a limiter, quite frankly. So you had a 3 of and then a 4 of to combine for game. In this deck, you actually have to combine a 1 of and a 3 of. And yeah, as I mentioned, there are some alternative ways where you grind through machines, but Cyberstein, if you wanted to OTK, was just the more obvious choice. This deck comes along, though, and is really the very first time that Chimeratech saw real play. Now, people sometimes played an Overload Fusion or 2 here or there in machine-based decks that had Cyberstein as well, but this was the very first time that a deck devoted itself to summoning Chimeratech as consistently as possible, even though Future Fusion was only at 1. And as I alluded to in the introduction, obviously saw a lot of success. 3 members of Team Rampage top-aided. Paul Lynn actually won SJC Orlando with a Chimeratech-based deck, so for the very first time, and it was the very first event after Cyberstein was emergency banned, this sort of secondary OTK out at the time that never really got to flourish with 3 Future Fusions had an opportunity to shine and obviously did really well. Won the event, half the top slots were Chimeratech decks. So it's an interesting point of this deck. Future Fusion is just so pivotal because, yes, sending 14 machines makes Overload Fusion live. But sending 14 machines out of your deck also means that there's 14 less cards in your deck that aren't named Overload Fusion. Right, you have a 40-card deck, you draw 6. Let's say you don't have Overload, but you have Future Fusion. You play Future Fusion, and now your 34-card deck is all of a sudden a 20-card deck. And in those 20 cards, you have Jar of Greeds, Card Destructions, Graceful Charities, Reckless Greeds. You have so much draw power. It's very likely at that point that you're going to see an Overload Fusion because you have, let's say, 3 Overloads in 20 cards. Right? You have a pretty reasonable chance every draw step, and draw steps going forward, that you're going to end up seeing a combo piece, particularly because so many of the other cards in your deck are just draw cards. So Future Fusion not only dumps all the machines so that Overload is immediately live, it also slims your deck so that going forward, the likelihood of drawing Overload Fusion increases, which is why when Future Fusion is limited to 1, a lot of people put this deck on the back burner, right? Because this is such an important combo piece, both in increasing the odds of drawing into Overload, but making Overload immediately live. So just an interesting thing. We never actually got to see this deck at its full potential with 3 Futures, but definitely still was successful with just 1. And then very quickly, the trap lineup. So we have 3 copies of Jar of Greed. It just simply draws a card. I'm not going to quite say it's like Upstart that makes it a 37-card deck, but at this point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history, you can pretty reliably expect to see another turn unless you draw this and you're about to die. If you draw this relatively early, it basically functions as an Upstart Goblin. Then we have 2 Reckless. It was limited to 2, so unfortunately for the Reckless Greed fans, you cannot play 3. It's probably still worth the slot. We obviously don't care about missing draw phases if we win the game. And then 1 copy of Mirror Force. You know, this deck can't just devote every single card in the deck exclusively to only the OTK. As I mentioned, there are alternative games where you need to rely on other means of winning, and this deck can win without ever seeing Overload, and having a card like Mirror Force is a pretty useful tool in those type of games. So that is our 40-card main deck. For the extra deck, we're at a point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where you could basically have an unlimited extra deck, which is something I would always advocate if you went back to actually play these formats. That way you're kind of hiding what you're actually running, but the cards that are just absolutely necessary. So we need a Cyber End Dragon, although we don't play Stein. Stein, of course, is emergency banned at this point, so we're not going to have Stein in our deck at all. I can't really imagine why you'd want to do it. Maybe there is a game state where, for whatever reason, you open 3 Overload Fusions, and all of them got card destruction, right? Your opponent's playing, let's say, Dark World. So you have no Overload Fusions left in your deck, and you draw Future Fusion. Well, what do? Well, you could still send for Chimeratech, but Chimeratech is going to blow up the field and you're not actually going to be able to summon anything. Let's say your opponent has Spirit Reaper set and you need a way of winning. So you could Future Fusion, send all 3 Cyber Dragons for Cyber End Dragon and summon it in 2 turns. Is that really realistically going to happen? Probably not, but I came up with at least a scenario where people are playing these cards at that point in Yu-Gi-Oh's history where maybe 1 in 1,000 games you need Cyber End, and I'm going to put it in my deck because of that. So you definitely need Cyber End. Cyber Twin is a little bit more reasonable. You probably don't need 3 copies, but Cyber Twin is way more reasonable in the sense that you could send double Cyber Dragon and get Cyber Twin Dragon in 2 turns, and it's a pretty reasonable card. Now, honestly, what are you sending off for Future Fusion? You're sending 14 machines that you can summon Chimeratech. And I think you want 3, right? I mean, at this point in time, it wasn't reprinted, so you would have to shell out the money for Ultra. You probably don't need Ultimate copies, but you would definitely need Chimeratechs. If you don't draw Future Fusion and use Overload Fusion to banish all of your machines. Let's say you play a drawn-out game, you have to do these small Overload Fusions. You have 3 Cyber Dragons, you technically can summon 3 Chimeratechs in the course of a game. So you definitely do want 3 copies. It's probably as unlikely as summoning Cyber End Dragon, but it doesn't hurt to have 3 copies, right? Let's say early in the game, you just need a Chimeratech out. Let's say a 2400 Chimeratech just to crash into a Monarch. Well, that used one Cyber Dragon. And then later in the game, you have yet to draw future, but you have a couple other machines plus that Chimeratech, so you summon another Chimeratech. And then late in the game, you use the Chimeratech to actually win the game. So because you have 3 overloads, I would actually recommend having all 3 copies of Chimeratech. So what do we expect to play against? I'm going to acknowledge the mirror match, though. The funny thing is, if you made the top 8 of SJC Orlando, half the matchups may have been the mirror match because there were 4 in the top 8. However, generally speaking, the deck was pretty under the radar, so I wouldn't assume there would be too many mirror matches, but I'm going to put this down just to acknowledge its existence. I'm going to put down Ancient Gear Drill because that's the version that actually won SJC Orlando. Paul Linz used to call it Rusty Bucket of Bolts, was that Chimeratech deck based on Ancient Gear Drill, where you would activate this card and set either Future or Overload Fusion. For those of you who don't know what this does, because it's a super old card, you can only activate if you control an Ancient Gear. And there's an Ancient Gear that basically cold waves, so it pseudo works as a spell and trap removal. And then you would set Overload or Future Fusion off this effect, because by having a gear on the field, you discard a card and then set any spell in your deck face down. You can't actually activate it though, but if you use Giant Trunade, you bounce that spell to your hand and now it's unlocked from that restriction, and then you can actually just activate it. So combining this with Giant Trunade basically lets you tutor out the combo pieces like Future Fusion. So it was basically a way of tutoring Future Fusion. So in this deck, it's quote-unquote unsearchable, the one that I just profiled, the Rampage version. In the Ancient Gear version, if you combine it with Giant Trunade, it actually was tutorable. So I'm going to put these here, though they weren't super common decks to play against. What you would expect to play against, particularly at that event, was Gadgets. This was actually the very, very, very first event, at least SJC level, where Gadgets were legal. So this particular archetype I plan on profiling relatively soon, had just tons of hype. I mean, massive, 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 massive hype. This deck did so well overseas, and when it finally reached the shores of America, this was the very first event that people could play. People were super excited to play something that was just totally unique and new. So Gadgets would have been a pretty common matchup at the time. You could expect to still play against Macrocosmo-based decks. People actually thought Macro was pretty good against Gadgets. Not that Gadgets relied on the graveyard, but the original Gadget decks, particularly the old quote-unquote 5th Gadget decks, and I'll eventually profile what that means at some point, was just chock full of one-on-one removal. Fissure, Smash and Ground, Sakuratsu Armor, Widespread Ruin. I'm talking about as many of those, Rush Recklessly even, Shrink if you could afford it as a prize card. But those decks had a ton of those 1-for-1 removal cards, and if you just summon DD Survivor, 1-for-1 removal if Macro's on the field doesn't do anything. So that deck actually saw a little bit of play, even though it didn't necessarily line up against any graveyard-based effects. It lined up with what the rest of the Gadget deck was trying to do. You absolutely have to anticipate collection of Monarch decks. There's still sort of the quote-unquote Spicer Monarch deck, the Apprentice-based one that was still common at the time. Some decks played Hydrogeddon in that. Some decks were just good stuff decks with Hydrogeddon. Some decks played Hydrogeddon in Monarchs. Hydrogeddon was especially common at this event because Gadgets obviously get destroyed by Hydrogeddon. If your opponent has 2 Gadgets on the field, one Hydra just attacks over both and summons all 3 Hydrogeddons. So this card is actually more common at this event than maybe other events. It's actually a card you have to worry about in this particular machine-based deck too, because obviously Hydrogeddon can attack over your machines, but you can also bait your opponent, because if you have Overload Fusion, you don't have Future Fusion, and you can only do a small Overload Fusion. If your opponent actually summons 3 Hydras in attack mode, that clogs their field with attack position monsters, and Chimeratech can actually attack over all 3 of them. So you can actually win with a small Chimeratech without Future Fusion if you let your opponent Hydra get on you. So something to consider. And then Chamberlain is actually probably one of the quote-unquote archetypes at the time, the theme decks, the type of deck that you would really have to worry about in this particular side deck that we're going to talk about that Rampage built really, really accommodated for that. But that is the other sort of top deck at the time. So they played 3 copies of Snipe Hunter. I actually hate Snipe Hunter a lot in Retro Yu-Gi-Oh!, but it was a card that saw a lot of play. You know, it's a card that against, burn-based strategies you might want to side it in against. It's honestly not a card that I think is very good, but they all sided 3 copies of it, all the members of Team Rampage, so I'm going to acknowledge that and put down the 3 copies. For Chainburn, there were 3 copies of Death Wombat and 3 copies of Royal Decree. They were not messing around. They did not want to lose to Chainburn, and clearly allotting basically the best cards possible, plus your deck plays Jinzo already, and even Spell Canceller is not that bad against that deck. Having these 6 copies is obviously fantastic. They played 3 they technically played 3 copies of Wabaku. I don't actually have Wabaku, which is hilarious, so I'm going to replace Wabaku with Champion Pack Threatening Roars. I don't have Wabakus, but I have these. 3 copies of a card of this equivalency. This is particularly good against the mirror match, though they actually did acknowledge the mirror match a little bit. What's interesting, though, is, as I alluded to in the introduction, because Cyberstein was emergency banned, there was the perception going into the event that people could cut this style of card from their side deck, right? If Cyberstein's not legal, why side a card like Wabaku? If you don't have to worry about getting OTK'd by Cyberstein, what are you going to get OTK'd by? Well, the answer was Chimeratech. That's why Chimeratech likely did that well at that specific event. It's really a cool event because of the history of that particular emergency banning. To some degree, they anticipated at least other players acknowledging that. There was actually a little bit of Ben Kai, Armored Samurai Ben Kai hype going into the event, another style of OTK. So having a card like Waboku might seem out of place because this specific deck was successful because other people cut this. But if you were on this specific style of deck, maybe you knew the possibility that this was a reality and therefore had a card like Waboku. The other cards are just sort of some generic one-ups. A Ring of Destruction, just a reasonable card, right? This deck, as I alluded to, needs to be able to win some of those alternative games, which is also the case with Torrential Tribute. And then I actually think they probably could have mained Gravity Bind, quite frankly. Gravity Bind is obviously fantastic when you're trying to stall the game out. You have Giant Trinade and Heavy Storm that clears this. You're not attacking under Gravity Bind basically ever, right? You're not really planning on attacking with something like Morphing Jar. But this is going to prolong the game. This card is just amazing against something like Gadgets, right? You do this card, you flip this card against Gadgets, you prolong the game, you eventually draw the OTK, and then you OTK them. And because this specific deck was not as common, you're not likely... I don't want to quite word it like that. You are somewhat likely to encounter opponents who don't realize that under Gravity Bind, they need to shift all their monsters to defense mode as opposed to attack mode, because Chimeratech will just attack over the attack position ones and likely kill them, which is another reason why enemy control is pretty good, by the way. But without further ado, that is our look at the Chimeratech deck. The Team Rampage was able to bring 3 copies to the top 8 of SJC Orlando right after the emergency banning of Cyberstein. Check back soon for plenty more Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. It's Joe Giorlando signing off.